December 2nd, 1936. A small apartment in Manhattan. Inside, a 70-year-old man is dying of pneumonia. His sister Ida sits beside the bed. So does his nurse. So does his old friend, Frank Hennessy. Out in the next room, his lawyers are working against the clock. Tomorrow morning, his entire estate goes to auction. Furniture, paintings, properties, everything they can carry out the door. He has $311 in the bank. This is John Ringling. 11 years earlier, Time magazine put his face on its cover and called him the 13th richest man in America. He owned every major circus in the country. He had railroads in Oklahoma, oil leases, a private rail car, a fleet of Rolls Royces, and a 36,000 square foot palace on Sarasota Bay called Ka Dazan. He is going to die a few hours before the men with the gavels arrive. I have spent the last few weeks digging through court transcripts, divorce filings, and old clippings from the Sarasota Herald. The more I read, the stranger this whole thing gets. Because what John Ringling did in those final hours was something almost no fallen tycoon of his decade managed to pull off. He saved the house, the mansion, the museum next door, the Rubens paintings, all of it he handed to the people of Florida. Not to his nephews, not to his second wife, not to his creditors. He went around all of them, and the state of Florida had to wait 10 years before they could actually take possession. This is the story of Ka Dazan, Sarasota's Venetian palace. A circus king's love letter to a woman who would not live to see her 60th birthday. A building abandoned for a decade after his death. A place so ruined by the late 1990s that Hollywood walked in, looked at the dust and the rotted wallpaper and said, "We don't need to build a thing." The location was already Miss Havisham's mansion, ready to film. But before any of that, before the second wife, the federal tax claim, the unfinished Ritz-Carlton on Longboat Key, the family feud over where to bury the bodies. Before all of it, there was a man dying in a New York apartment with $311 to his name, and a will that against every reasonable expectation was about to work. There is a photograph of him from 1925. Heavy overcoat, gloves in one hand, a cigar in the other. He looks like a man who owns the room he is standing in. Which, in fairness, he probably did. 11 years later, he is being carried in a wheelchair to sign papers a financier once signed. He has a fever of 104. His nurse is protesting. He signs anyway. That is the speed of this collapse. From the cover of Time to a wheelchair in a Brooklyn courtroom in less than a decade. Most fallen tycoons of the early 1930s did not get a chance to plan their exit. They jumped from windows or quietly disappeared into apartments in Queens. Ringling had a longer goodbye, and he used it. By the time he died, he had been rewriting his will for years, each version a little tighter than the last, each one designed to keep one specific outcome from happening. The creditors were not going to get the house, or the paintings, or anything connected to Mabel. To his second wife, Emily, he left $1. To the rest of the family, depending on which branch and which particular fight, varying amounts of nothing. The state of Florida got the rest, not the cash, which barely existed. The buildings, the Sarasota Bay estate, the museum he had spent the last decade filling with European art, the unfinished hotel out on Longboat Key, the land. He signed it all over to Tallahassee. It took Tallahassee 10 years to actually receive it. The federal government wanted its tax money first. The widow Emily, recently divorced and now suddenly the widow of a man she had divorced, filed claims. So did nephews. So did former business partners. So did banks. So did the trustee for a circus stock voting agreement Ringling had signed in that fevered Brooklyn moment. Everyone, it turned out, had a piece of paper saying they were owed something. Through all of it, Ka Dazan sat empty. A house designed to be filled. 56 rooms, 5 guest suites, a ballroom with a ceiling painted by the man who designed the Ziegfeld Follies, an organ wired directly into the walls, 2,289 pipes wide enough to carry sound through every floor, and nobody in it. The Florida humidity worked on the wood. The salt air worked on the terracotta. By the time the legal fight ended in 1946, and the doors finally opened to the public, Ka Dazan was already a decade into its decline. It had another 50 years of decline ahead of it. This is the part of the Ringling story I find harder to let go of than the auction or the $300. The will worked. He outmaneuvered the creditors. He got the house to the public. And then the public did not really have the money to take care of it. So how does a man go from a Pullman rail car and a Park Avenue address to a wheelchair and $300 in the space of 11 years? You have to back up about 60 years to find the start. To a small town in Iowa, a German harness maker with 7 sons, and a 5th boy who would grow up to put his face on the cover of Time. McGregor, Iowa, 1866? A small Mississippi River town, population maybe a few hundred. A German harness maker named August Ringling, who simplified his name to Ringling somewhere between the boat from Hanover and his first storefront, lives there with his French wife Marie and their growing collection of sons, 5 of them by the time their 5th boy is born that May. 2 more eventually. 1 daughter, Ida. They are not poor in any tragic sense, but they are the kind of family where the boys learn to make their own entertainment because nobody is buying them tickets to anyone else's. The 5th boy is named John. He grows up watching his older brothers improvise, singing, tumbling, juggling. By the time he is 16, he is the song and dance member of an act called the Classic and Comic Concert Company, working small Midwestern towns with his brothers. 2 seasons of that. It barely pays. In 1884, in Baraboo, Wisconsin, the brothers add a horse, a bear, and a tent. They call it a circus, charging 25 cents at the door. Most circus histories race past the next few years because nothing in them is dramatic. The Ringlings tour. They get bigger. They add more animals. They survive. Their first elephant arrives in 1888. Their first private rail car comes a year later when they realize that horse-drawn wagons cannot keep up with what they are trying to do. That decision, the rail cars, is the one that mattered. A wagon-based circus could only reach the next county. A rail circus could play 4 cities a week. By 1890, the Ringling brothers were running close to 100 rail cars per season. By the late 1890s, they were direct competition with Barnum and Bailey, the established giant of the industry. In 1907, after Bailey died, the brothers bought him out for $400,000. They now owned both names. The 2 biggest circuses in America belonged to 5 brothers from Wisconsin. John was 39 years old when this happened, and he was no longer the song and dance kid. He had become the brother who did the route planning, the advance work, the contracts. The New York Times described him in 1890 as a human encyclopedia on road and local conditions. He could look out a Pullman window, glance at a few landmarks, and tell you exactly where in the country he was. He was already wealthy by 1890. Quietly, deeply wealthy. 2 years before the Bailey purchase, in 1895, John had married a woman named Mabel Burton. Here's what we actually know about Mabel, which is less than you would expect. She was probably born in a farming community called Moons, Ohio. The date is uncertain. Some records say 1874. Most say 1875. The exact birthday became less and less specific every time she crossed the Atlantic with John, because she kept rounding herself younger on the customs forms. By the time she met John, she had already left Ohio, worked in a factory, and made her way to Chicago. The most common story has her waitressing in a Tony Chicago restaurant when John walked in. She was 30. He was 39. They married on December 29th, 1905, in Hoboken, New Jersey. She gave exactly 1 interview in her life, to a Seattle reporter, about traveling with the circus. Beyond that, she stayed off the record. No society columns, no press portraits. The few photographs that survive show a slender, dark-haired woman with sharp cheekbones who clearly preferred not to be photographed at all. What she had, and what her husband recognized, was taste. Real taste. Not the kind you buy. The kind you develop over years of looking at things and deciding what you actually like. She and John traveled. A lot. Europe, mostly. They went to Venice and she fell in love with it, which in the early 1900s was not a particularly original thing for an American to do. But she did not just admire Venice, she studied it. By 1925, A Sarasota newspaper would describe her as one of the best read women in the country on architecture and landscape design. She read books. She kept files. She took photographs. Somewhere in those Venice trips, the idea of the house began. But the house needed a place to stand, and the brothers had already, almost by accident, found the place. In 1909, John and Mabel spent their first winter in a small Florida town called Sarasota. It was not yet anything. A few hundred residents, a handful of hotels, mosquitoes, mangrove coast. The kind of place wealthy northerners had started talking about, but had not yet shown up in any numbers. 2 years later, in 1911, the Ringlings bought 20 acres of waterfront from a couple named Thompson. There was an existing house on the lot, a wood-frame Victorian called Palms Elysian, built in 1895. Nothing special. A nice porch, a view of the bay. The Ringlings moved in for the winters and stayed for over a decade, in that house, looking at that view, thinking about what they would eventually build there. The plot was now the Ringling estate. The bay was now the Ringling view. The mansion was still 15 years away, but it had a site, and it had Mabel, who knew exactly what she wanted it to look like. Then, in the early 1900s, the Ringling family started running out of brothers. Otto died in 1911 suddenly, Albert the oldest in 1915, Henry in 1918 during the Spanish flu, Alfred T. in 1919. Each death meant John inherited more responsibility, more shares, more decision-making power over a circus empire that was now consolidating into fewer and fewer hands. By the early 1920s, John and his older brother Charles were essentially the company. 2 men running what had been 5. Charles handled the day-to-day. John handled everything else, which by this point included real estate, railroads, oil leases, and the slow accumulation of a private art collection. By 1923, John was ready to build. Mabel had her files and her photographs. John had his money and a piece of bayfront land. They needed an architect. His name was Dwight James Baum, and he was about to become very busy. The drawing sat on a desk in Riverdale, in the Bronx, where a 37-year-old architect named Dwight James Baum had been working through the night for weeks. His clients were not in town. They were in Italy. They had sent him photographs. A lot of photographs. Baum had been designing revival-style houses in the Bronx for a decade and was the youngest person ever to win the gold medal of the Architectural League of New York. Tudors and Mediterraneans mostly. The kind of work that earns respect without making you famous. The Ringlings hired him in 1923. He spent the next 2 years on a single project. He never matched it again. The brief Baum walked into would have unsettled most architects. The clients had a clear vision but no architectural training. The site was on a Florida bay, which meant the building would have to fight humidity, salt air, and hurricanes for the rest of its life. The reference materials sat in stacks of photographs, postcards, and torn-out magazine pages on Mabel Ringling's desk. Most of those references pointed to one place: Venice. Mabel had been to Venice multiple times by then, and she had not visited it the way most American tourists did. She had studied the Doge's palace. She had looked at the Ca d'Oro on the Grand Canal, the 15th century palazzo whose Gothic tracery and waterside facade became the visual spine of what she wanted. She had photographs of specific window treatments. She had notes on tile colors. By the time she sat down with Baum, she was not asking him to design her dream house. She was asking him to draft what was already in her head. Baum, to his credit, did not fight her. The site work began in 1924. The general contractor was Owen Burns, who was already John's business partner on a dozen Sarasota real estate ventures. Burns brought in the dredging equipment that had built the islands offshore. 2 on-site architects, Earl Purdy and Ralph Twitchell, handled day-to-day supervision. Twitchell would later become a founding figure in the Sarasota School of Architecture, but in 1924 he was a junior man on someone else's project. The terracotta came from a small factory in Crumlin, Pennsylvania, called O.W. Ketchum. The terrace marble came from 6 different countries. The roof tiles came from Spain. The window glass, eventually, came in colored panels designed to catch the marine light at sunset and throw it back into the rooms in greens and ambers. Mabel approved every shade, and there is a detail in the building records that I think tells you more about her than any of the architectural drawings. The Ringlings hired a Hungarian-born artist named Willy Pogany to paint the ceiling of the ballroom. Pogany was already famous. He had designed the murals at the New Amsterdam Theater in New York, the home of the Ziegfeld Follies. He had illustrated children's books that are still reprinted today. Florenz Ziegfeld himself had introduced the Ringlings to him. Mabel did not just hire Pogany. She specified the subject: 26 panels of dancers from cultures around the world set into a gilded, coffered ceiling. Some of those depictions look stereotyped to modern eyes, and curators acknowledge that openly, but the ambition is what matters. A ballroom ceiling in a private home in Sarasota, Florida, in 1925, depicting global folk traditions. That is not the choice of a woman copying someone else's house. That is somebody making a statement about what she wanted her parties to feel like. The ballroom was the showpiece, but the building had 56 rooms. The first floor was for entertaining, a great hall called the Court, big enough that the Ringlings built the entire mansion around an Aeolian organ with 2,289 pipes. A breakfast room, a dining room with painted plaster ceilings designed to look like carved wood, a reception room, a ballroom that flowed onto a 13,000 square foot bayside terrace made of marble laid in chevron patterns where guests arriving by yacht could step directly off their boats and into the party. The second floor was private, bedrooms, dressing rooms, and a balcony that looked out over Sarasota Bay. The third floor was a playroom, with another Pogany ceiling, this one painted with scenes of Venetian carnival, including a fanciful self-portrait of the Ringlings surrounded by their dogs and exotic birds. Above all of that rose the Belvedere Tower. 5 stories, modeled after the bell tower of the Cathedral of Seville, crowned with terracotta tracery copied directly from the Ca d'Oro in Venice. From the top, on a clear day, you could see all of Sarasota Bay and most of the islands the Ringlings either owned or were in the process of building. Mabel's name for the house was Ca d'Zan, House of John in Venetian dialect. The name was hers. The man it honored had paid for everything but designed almost nothing. By the autumn of 1926, the building was ready. It cost $1.5 million to build, which is the figure most sources still quote. Adjusted to today, the number lands somewhere over 25 million, depending on which inflation calculator you trust. The Ringlings moved in, they threw a few parties. Country Life magazine ran a feature in 1927 calling it a Venetian palace in Florida. For a brief moment, Ca d'Zan was exactly what Mabel had set out to build. A place that looked like nothing else on the Gulf Coast, on a piece of bay that had been mangrove swamp 15 years earlier, hosting people like Will Rogers and the governor of New York. That moment was very short, because while Baum and Burns had been finishing the terraces, John Ringling had been doing something else. He had been buying. Not just paintings, hotels, land, causeway rights, an entire second hotel project on the southern tip of Longboat Key. And the financial weather, in the autumn of 1926, was already starting to turn. The hurricane that would change Florida had already made landfall in Miami 3 weeks before Mabel cut the ribbon on her ballroom. She did not know yet that the boom had ended. Almost nobody did. The green Rolls-Royce crossed the bridge first. It was New Year's Day. The bridge was not officially open yet, but the man who had paid for it wanted the honor of driving across before anyone else. So he did. From the Sarasota mainland, over the dredged channel, onto the quays he had built out of mangrove swamp. This is John Ringling at the absolute peak of his life. 59 years old, the cover of Time magazine's 6 months in his rearview mirror, calling him the 13th richest man in America. A net worth the press estimated at around $200 million in the money of the day. And a bridge he had paid for himself, for $750,000, then donated to the city. In February of 1926, the bridge opened to the public. Within days, the Sarasota Herald reported that John had sold $1 million worth of property in a single afternoon. Lots on St. Armand's Circle, Lido Key, and Longboat Key, starting at $3,000 and rising fast. Then he made his big bet. On the southern tip of Longboat Key, on a piece of land that was mostly sand at low tide, John signed a deal with the Ritz-Carlton Company. $5,000 a year for the right to use the name. 350 rooms, 3 golf courses, a waterfront castle of a hotel designed to draw the kind of wealthy northerners who normally wintered in Palm Beach. He put $400,000 of his own money into it, with another $400,000 expected from co-investors. Construction started in March. By late summer, the exterior of the hotel was framed, the first golf course was nearly playable, and a few rooms were almost ready for guests. That is when the boom stopped being real. It is hard to date the exact moment the Florida land bubble burst, because it did not burst. It deflated. Property prices in Miami had been softening since the spring. Banks were getting nervous. By the early autumn of 1926, a Sarasota lot that had sold for $10,000 in February could not find a buyer at half that price. And then, on September 18th, the hurricane came ashore. The Great Miami Hurricane was a Category 4 storm that made landfall in the middle of the night and killed close to 400 people. It did not hit Sarasota directly. Sarasota was far enough north to be spared the worst. But Sarasota did not need to be hit. The hurricane killed the buyers. Northerners who had been thinking about wintering in Florida looked at the headlines and decided not this year. The slow deflation became a hard collapse. John kept building. The obvious move in October of 1926 would have been to stop, halt construction on the Ritz, mothball the golf courses, wait the storm out financially. Plenty of his peers did exactly that. Construction sites all over Florida fell silent that autumn. He did the opposite. That spring, before the hurricane, John had purchased 4 enormous canvases by Peter Paul Rubens from the Duke of Westminster's collection. They were oil-on-canvas studies for a tapestry cycle Rubens had designed in the 1620s for the Spanish princess Isabella Clara Eugenia. Each painting was the size of a small wall. John's own art advisor, a German dealer named Julius Bohler, had warned him off the purchase. Rubens had fallen out of fashion. The price was too high. According to Bohler's later account, John refused to listen, insisting the paintings had to be his. There was nowhere to put them. None of John's existing buildings could fit canvases that size. He bought them anyway because by then he had decided he was going to build a museum next door to Ca' d'Azan. 21 galleries, modeled on an Italian palazzo. Construction would start the following year. In November of 1926, with the Ritz-Carlton bleeding cash and Florida real estate cratering, John finally stopped Ritz construction. The skeleton of the hotel stood with its lower floors finished and its upper floors framed. He told reporters he would resume the moment conditions improved. He never did. That same autumn, his older brother Charles died. Charles had been the operating manager, the brother who handled day-to-day, who more than anyone kept John from making decisions that were too big, too fast, or too expensive. With Charles gone, John was the last Ringling brother. 5 sons of an Iowa harness maker had built a circus empire together, and now 4 of them were in cemeteries. The 5th, the most ambitious, was about to run everything alone in a Florida market that had just finished evaporating. The Ringling fortune still looked impressive on paper. The mansion was almost finished. The museum was about to break ground. The Rubens canvases were on a steamer headed for New York. 3 years of relative quiet lay ahead. Then the catastrophe really arrived. For a woman married to one of the most photographed men in America, there is a striking lack of Mabel Ringling in the public record. She gave one newspaper interview in her entire life, to a Seattle reporter about traveling with the circus. She refused to be photographed by the press. She did not appear in society columns. The few times her name shows up in print before 1929, it is usually attached to John's, the wife of, the hostess of, the woman who decorated. When she died on June 8, 1929, in a New York hospital, The obituaries were short. Most of them did not mention what she had actually died of. She had Addison's disease. She had also had diabetes for years. Both conditions were treatable in theory by 1929, but only if you had access to the right specialists, and only if you started early. Mabel had probably been managing both for a long time before anyone outside the family knew. Her doctors believed her conditions were the reason she and John had never had children. The medical advice in the 1920s for a woman with Addison's was that pregnancy could kill her. She was 54 years old. John was with her when she died. So was her sister. The funeral was private, attended by family. Her body went into a temporary receiving vault in Englewood, New Jersey, the cemetery closest to their summer home. John meant to build her a permanent crypt. He never did. A loss from which John never really recovered. That is how the Ringling Museum's own archive describes it, more than 90 years later. I have read the line in 3 different official sources, almost word for word. It is the kind of thing institutions write because the truth is harder to phrase. The truth is that John spent the next 7 years making decisions that would have been unthinkable while Mabel was alive. The first one came almost immediately. Less than a year before Mabel's death, in late 1928, John had begun negotiating to buy the American Circus Corporation. It was the second largest circus operation in America, owner of 5 separate touring shows including the Sells Floto Circus and the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus. The price was $1.7 million. John did not have the cash. He had real estate that nobody was buying, an unfinished hotel that nobody could finish, and a museum he was still building in Sarasota. He went to a financier named William Grieve, the president of New York Investors. They had met at a prize fight earlier that year. Grieve agreed to lend John the full amount. As collateral, John signed over half of all his circus stock. The deal closed in early 1929. John now owned every major traveling circus in the United States. Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, Sells Floto, Hagenbeck Wallace, John Robinson, Sparks, the Al G. Barnes Circus. A total monopoly on American tented entertainment. It was the dream he had been chasing since his brothers started buying out competitors 30 years earlier. It was also the worst possible moment to take on debt. Mabel died in June. The stock market crashed in October. By the end of 1929, the American economy was in free fall. Ticket sales for traveling entertainment had cratered, and John was making interest payments on a loan he could no longer afford. New York Investors, the firm that held his note, was itself sliding toward bankruptcy. There is something in the timing here that the standard summaries miss. The American Circus Corporation deal, the one that destroyed him financially, was already done before Mabel was buried. The contract was signed. The collateral was pledged. By the time her doctors lost the fight to save her in June, John had already mortgaged half his circus empire to a financier he had met at a boxing match. He just did not know yet that the bottom was about to fall out. In the months after the funeral, John traveled. To New York, to Europe, to anywhere that was not Sarasota. Ca d'Azan, the house he and Mabel had spent 2 years building, sat mostly empty for long stretches of late 1929. The rose garden she had personally planned, with its wagon wheel layout, was already starting to need someone to look after it. The decisions John made in the year that followed reveal a man who had stopped consulting his own better judgment. The only person whose judgment he had trusted for 24 years was gone. And there was nobody around him capable of replacing her. What came next happened fast. Her name was Emily Haig Buck. She was a Park Avenue widow in her early 40s, living at the Barclay Hotel on East 48th Street. She had money of her own, although the source of that money is one of the things the historical record leaves vague. She met John Ringling on the 4th of July, 1930 in Amsterdam. He was 64 and had been a widower for a year. They courted that summer through Europe, then carried it back to New York. By November, they had decided to marry. The ceremony took place on December 19th in the office of Frank Hague, the powerful Democratic mayor of Jersey City. 4 days before the wedding, John borrowed $50,000 from Emily. She lent it to him. He never repaid it. That detail, which Sarasota historian Jeff LaHerd documented from court records, is the key to everything that followed. The marriage began with John in financial trouble he had not disclosed to her, signing a personal loan from his fiancée to cover obligations. He promised to repay her in 3 months. Within those same days, he also presented her with a document waiving her dower rights to his estate. He said she signed it, then later destroyed it. She said she destroyed it without ever signing. The honeymoon ended fast. Emily moved into Ca d'Azan and ran into the problem any second wife of a recent widower runs into. The house was Mabel's. Mabel had chosen everything in it. Mabel's monogram was on the pillowcases. Her bedroom was beside John's. Emily was assigned the bedroom down the hall. In her later testimony, Emily described the experience as suffocating. She had married a man whose first wife was, in some practical sense, still living in the house with them. John gave a different picture. In his version, Emily was the one who broke the marriage, with constant cocktail parties, her sister and nephew installed as long-term guests, and a refusal to leave him in peace. Both versions appear in the divorce filings. Both appear self-serving. In July of 1933, John filed for divorce. Emily was served the papers at the Cress 5 and 10 store on Main Street in Sarasota. She had been shopping. According to her later testimony, when the server handed her the documents, she said, "My husband. There must be some mistake. You must mean Mrs. Charles Ringling." John withdrew the suit within weeks. He came into her room at Ca d'Azan, asked her to stay, and reportedly told her not to be foolish about it. She stayed. He pressed her, repeatedly, to extend the original $50,000 loan and to formally waive her rights to the museum and the art collection. If she would do that, he said, the divorce would not be refiled. She refused. In February of 1934, while John was in Sarasota and Emily was in New York, she wrote him a Valentine letter. The relevant portion, in her own words, "I love you until my dying day." A month later, John refiled the divorce. The grounds this time were mental cruelty and ungovernable temper. The trial that followed became the most expensive divorce in Florida history up to that point. Both sides spent fortunes on lawyers. The press called the testimony a three-ring circus. Each day brought new accusations. John testified that Emily had struck him, hard enough that it felt like being hit by a heavyweight boxer. Emily testified that John was paranoid, obsessed with his deceased first wife, and carrying on with his nurse, Ina Sanders. Sanders denied it. The judge granted the divorce on July 6, 1936. John was the legal winner. Both his remaining money and most of Emily's went to lawyers. 5 months later, John was dead. In his final will, he remembered Emily with a $1. Reading the divorce file now, what stays with me is not the courtroom theater. It is the asymmetry of the documentation. John's version of the marriage is preserved in his own legal filings, his lawyer's rhetoric, and the press coverage that took his side. Emily's version exists mostly in cross-examination and her surviving letters. The Valentine note, the one where she swore she loved him until her dying day, was written 6 weeks before he refiled to end the marriage. While John and Emily were spending their last cash on lawyers, the people who were really going to take the circus away from him were already moving. They were not in the courtroom. They were in a board meeting in Sarasota. 10 years after John Ringling died, the doors of Ca d'Azan finally opened to the public. It was the spring of 1946. The federal tax claim had been settled, the creditors paid off or worn down, the will challenges resolved. The state of Florida finally took possession of the mansion, the museum, the unfinished hotel skeleton on Longboat Key, and what was left of the art collection. Ca d'Azan had been empty since John's death. Florida Humidity had spent 10 summers working on the wood floors and the silk wall coverings. Salt air had eaten at the terracotta on the Belvedere Tower. The Aeolian organ had not been played in a decade. Pogonese painted dancers were still on the ballroom ceiling, but the gilding around them had begun to flake. The state opened the building anyway. There was no money to do otherwise. What followed was 40 years of survival without preservation. The house was a museum in name. By the 1970s, parts of the second floor were closed off because the floors were no longer trusted. By the 1980s, vines had grown over some of the windows, and the original swimming pool had filled with stagnant water. Almost everything else John had built was gone or going. The Ritz-Carlton skeleton on Longboat Key was demolished in 1964. The El Vernona Hotel, which John had bought from Owen Burns and renamed after himself, was torn down in 1998 after years of decay. Ka Dizan was the last one standing. There is a separate story I have not told yet, which is the family fight over where to bury him. John and Mabel were placed in temporary receiving vaults in New Jersey in the 1930s, meant to be moved to a permanent crypt in Sarasota. The crypt was never built. The bodies sat in unmarked storage for 55 years, while branches of the family fought over the proper resting place. In 1991, John, Mabel, and his sister Ida were finally buried in the secret garden behind Ka Dizan. The family had spent more than half a century fighting over a man whose own last wish was to give everything he owned to the public. The house, meanwhile, was slowly falling down. In 1996, a Hollywood film crew arrived in Sarasota. Alfonso Cuarón was directing a modern adaptation of Great Expectations and needed a mansion that could play Miss Havisham's decaying estate. They walked through Ka Dizan and decided they did not need to dress the set. The house was already the set. The film, released in 1998, used Ka Dizan for both exterior and interior shots. Fundraising for restoration began that same year. In 1999, the building was closed. Florida State University had taken over management, and a 6-year project was launched to bring the house back. The estimated budget was $15 million, 10 times what the Ringlings had spent to build it. Ka Dizan reopened on April 27, 2002. The Belvedere Tower had been retiled with replicated terracotta, the ballroom ceiling re-gilded above Pogani's dancers, and 95% of the original furniture restored using historical photographs. In September of 2024, Hurricane Helene hit the Florida coast. 2 weeks later, Hurricane Milton followed. 8 feet of seawater flooded the basement. 2 unmoored boats from the bay crashed into the marble terrace, breaking sections of the chevron pattern Mabel had laid out almost a century earlier. By mid-2025, the first floor was reopened for self-guided visits. The upper floors were still closed. Ka Dizan is still standing. A man with $311 to his name wrote a will that almost no court should have honored, leaving a half-finished art collection and a Venetian palace on a Florida bay to a state government that did not want to deal with it. The will worked. The state took the house. The house outlasted the Depression. 50 years of underfunded public stewardship, a Hollywood crew that came to film its decay, and 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks. The circus he loved went bankrupt and was sold off. The hotel he started on Longboat Key was demolished. Most of the boom-era mansions of the Florida coast are gone. St. Armand's Circle, which he laid out himself, is now condos. The house remains. Most of the men who built America's Gilded Age estates lost everything before they died, and most of the houses lost everything after. Ka Dizan is the rare exception. The man who built it died broke. A will written carefully by a dying man with $300 kept the doors open.